Hey guys, this video is for the sophomores. Remember to watch this video from start to finish. You will be responsible for all the material I talk about on this video and our live classes, of course, when you take your test on Monday. So please make sure you watch, for most importantly, and that you watch from start to finish. Now we're going to talk about two things today. We're focusing on the chaotic 1850s as sectional relations were getting much worse between North and South. The Kansas-Nebraska Act just aggravated things. Well, that's an understatement, but really, tattered relations between North and South in such a profound way that many ways it was irredeemable. So it was kind of the beginning of the end of the Union. Well, you could actually trace that back to the Mexican War, as I told you guys a bunch of times. But the real beginning of the end, was the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the chaotic aftermath of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But before we get to that, I want to talk about a political party that emerged during this chaotic time. Now, we talked on Monday about the Republican Party forming along the principles of free soil, the idea that slavery should never be allowed to expand. But right before the Republican Party was created, another political party was formed in the aftermath of the collapse of the Whig Party. Remember, the Whig Party was one of the two major parties. They collapsed because of the divide over slavery with Northern Whigs, between Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs. So as the Whig Party was dying, this actually left a giant void in terms of where are Whigs going to go now, right? There's a reason the reason they don't want to be Democrats. That's why they were Whigs, right? So it's hard for a lot of former Whigs, even Southern Whigs, to then join the Democratic Party because they were Whigs for a reason, right? Because they didn't like the Democrats. So a new party formed called the Know Nothing Party. Now this was, sorry about that, this was a really bizarre experiment in nativism. Now remember, nativism is when you oppose immigration. And remember, in the 1850s, we were living in a time when we had this mass immigration of people coming into the United States from Germany, but particularly from Ireland. And the majority of the immigrants coming into the United States during this time were Catholic. Now, it got to the point where by the 1850s, 1 in 5 Americans were either Irish or German immigrants, especially in some of the major cities of this country. So that was particularly threatening to a lot of nativist types. So a lot of people who were nativists tended to be in the Whig Party. The Whig Party as a whole, I will not say was a nativist party, but nativists felt more comfortable in the Whig Party because the Democrats always were very welcoming of immigrants. So the thing is that the Know Nothing Party was this, for a while, major political party that was formed in the 1850s to fill the void created by the collapse of the Whig Party, with these large numbers of Irish immigrants coming to the United States and the backlash against that. Now, the Know Nothing Party actually started as a semi-secret society, the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. It was a patriotic group that was really committed to stopping immigration, particularly Catholic immigration. Excuse me. Now, because it was a semi-secret society, members were instructed to say, members were instructed to answer if ever asked, well, what goes on in your club or your society? The answer was, I know nothing. That was, that was the official response that you were supposed to give if asked about the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. And that name stuck. So when it became a political party, which officially was called the American Party, they were known by almost everybody as the Know Nothings, because of this line that they were supposed to give when asked questions about the society. Now, the American Know Nothing Party favored strict limits on immigration. They particularly want to limit the rights of Catholic immigrants. And the proposals that they came up with were really extreme. For one, they proposed to expand the number of years it takes to become an American citizen from 5 years to 21 years. Now, remember, you can't vote unless you're a citizen. So a lot of these know-nothings did not want Irish people to vote because, they influenced a lot of elections, particularly in favor of the Democrats, who know-nothings did not like. Um, they said if you were not born in America, you should not be able to hold political office. Remember, there's a prohibition against people who are not born in America from becoming president. But if you're a foreign-born person, you're free to run for any other office. But the Know Nothings wanted to stop that and say that only native born people can actually become can run for office. They wanted to mandate Bible reading in all those new public schools that were created, presumably the King James version of the Bible, which is the Protestant version. They said only Protestants should be allowed to be teachers in the schools. They said that there should be strict restrictions on alcohol. The Know Nothings embraced the whole temperance movement that had formed in the wake of the Second Great Awakening because this perception that a lot of the newer immigrants were heavy drinkers. Now, immigration was changing the dynamics of the country, and there was this deep antagonism toward Catholics that rose to the surface in the 1850s and often bordered on the paranoid. The biggest fear that a lot of these Know Nothings had was that the Pope would control America, because one of their main beefs with Catholic immigration was the idea that if you're coming to the United States, your loyalty from a Catholic country, and if you're a Catholic yourself, your first loyalty will never be to the United States. Your first loyalty will always be to the Pope, who's a foreign leader. So that was at the heart of their anti-Catholic feeling. Even though anti-Catholicism had been around in America as long as there's been in America, as well, United States. Because remember, the people who created the United States were Pilgrims and Puritans. And why were they called Puritans? Because they wanted to purify the Church of England of Catholicism. So anti-Catholic feeling, or anti-clericalism, sometimes they call it, was deeply embedded in the American psyche for centuries. And here with the Know Nothings, it just rose to the surface. Now, the Know Nothings were particularly hostile to the Democratic Party because they felt that the Democratic Party was way too welcoming of immigrants. And this hostility to the Democratic Party is what attracted a lot of Whigs, or soon to be ex-Whigs, to the party. Now, the party did really well, really fast. As the Whigs were collapsing, a lot of Whigs were politically homeless. So instead, started voting for the Know Nothings. And in 1854, major northern cities voted majority Know Nothing. Chicago voted Know Nothing. Boston, which has a huge Irish population. Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. So major cities were actually voting Know Nothing. But I actually wrote like this really big paper on Know Nothingism when I was in school. Um, and I always wondered how much. Well, my question that I tried to answer in my paper was how much of the Know Nothing Party was actually nativism or just a home for ex-Whigs. And they decide to rally around this one issue as a way to kind of form their political party. Was it actually a deliberate attempt to try and distract people's attention away from slavery? Because slavery was threatening to destroy the United States. So one of my theories that I wrote about in the paper was that a lot of Know Nothings were hoping that just talking about talking about immigration would be a way to distract people's attention away from slavery, which is really the issue that was going to divide up the United States. So I think it was both. I think they certainly were nativists, but the party kind of formed just to provide some sort of home for Whigs and rally Americans around an issue that wasn't slavery. Now, what ultimately doomed the Know Nothing Party really wasn't their nativism, but it was the fact that they too found themselves dividing along sectional lines. Just the same thing that killed the Whig Party a couple of years earlier. Southern Know Nothings began dominating the party. Which is quite interesting. This is a major part of what I wrote about because there really wasn't much immigration in the South, right? So the reason why Southerners became Know Nothings at all was because they were Whigs and they wanted a new political home. And Southern Whigs began dominating the party to the point where it took on a very Southern flavor. And many Know Nothings in the North, who didn't like immigration or Catholic immigration in particular, but as time went on, they began to see slavery as the greater threat. And that's why a lot of them shifted over to the newly formed Republican Party. So just like the Whigs, the Know Nothings wound up collapsing under the strain of sectional tension between the North and South. But they were still around to run a presidential candidate in 1856, which we're actually going to talk about in live class. Now, we spent last live class talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the law that was passed that would actually, allow, well, form two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and allow them to vote on whether they want slavery. The whole idea of popular sovereignty. Now, I asked this question in class. Well, what do you think is going to happen? If people get to vote on slavery in these territories. And a bunch of you answered correctly that, well, now people are going to start moving in the territory in order to affect the vote about whether Kansas is going to have slavery or whether it's going to have it or whether it's not going to have it. Nebraska was so far up north that the idea of slavery really ever taking root there was really out of the question. But Kansas was a different story because Kansas is right near Maryland, right near Missouri, right near Indian Territory, near Texas, all slave states. So the feeling was that, maybe unofficially, but that Nebraska would be free and that Kansas would become a slave state. So what happened is that people began swarming into Kansas on both extremes. A group formed in the north called the New England Emigrant Aid Society. An emigrant is when you're leaving somewhere. An immigrant is when you're coming somewhere. So the New England Emigrant Aid Society actually formed to actually raise money to bring abolitionists and free soilers to Kansas in order to vote down slavery. So they paid for you to actually move there. So you have to be a pretty firm abolitionist or an anti-slavery person to really uproot your life completely and move to Kansas in order to vote down slavery. So these people were going to be the most extreme, and I don't mean that as a pejorative at all, because they were right, the abolitionists, of course. But you have to be pretty extreme if you're willing to actually move clear across the country. And they had a whole song. We crossed the prairie as of old, the pilgrims crossed the sea, to make the West as they the East, the homestead of the free. So they began moving there in order to vote down slavery. Now, Southerners, as we said, had hoped that Kansas would actually be a slave territory, even though by 1860, years after Kansas had first gotten settled, there were only 2 slaves that were living in Kansas. So in many ways, this was more of a theoretical discussion than anything else, because for all intents and purposes, there really weren't any slaves in Kansas. But in 1855, the year after the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, the first vote was held in Kansas on a territorial legislature. And people from Missouri began pouring into Kansas. They were called the Border Ruffians because they crossed the border from Missouri into Kansas. They poured in to vote for a pro-slavery legislature. These people were not residents of Kansas. They weren't even pretending to be residents of Kansas. They were from nearby Missouri. A lot of them voted multiple times, and they wound up winning the election because of outright fraud in the election. Not the type we hear about now, but like real fraud. Multiple votes, or votes by non-residents. And there were so many of these votes by the pro-slavery forces that they had enough to actually elect the first state legislature, which was pro-slavery. And they set up their state government in a city called Lecompton, Kansas, which is right on the border with Missouri. This is what one skeptical commentator said about the vote. There is not a pro-slavery man in Kansas who does not acknowledge that the bogus legislature was the result of a gigantic, well-planned fraud. And when this government was elected, they began passing outrageous laws. One was that if you wanted to get elected to office in Kansas, you had to support slavery. It said if you help a fugitive slave escape, you'd get 10 years in prison. And it also said abolitionist literature, like if you distribute literature across Kansas, saying that slavery should be abolished, you'd get the death penalty. So these laws were just so extreme that the Free Soilers actually set up a rival government in Topeka, Kansas. So there was 2 governments, one fraudulent and one illegal. And the violence began brewing into 1856 between the two forces, between the Free Soilers and the Border Ruffians, pro-slavery people, to the point where in 1856, pro-slavery forces burnt down the town of Lawrence, Kansas. Now, Lawrence, Kansas was a Free Soil city. Amazingly, nobody got killed. But the sack of Lawrence, which they call it, kind of like the sack of Rome back in Attila the Hun's time, really began making the Free Soilers really radicalized a lot of, well, they were already pretty radical, but it radicalized them even further. That this town was burnt, this Free Soil town was burnt to the ground. So in response to the sack of Lawrence, one of the most famous figures of 19th century American history emerged, a man named John Brown. Now, John Brown was a radical abolitionist, someone who believed that the only way that slavery was going to end was through violence. He was extremely religious, almost messianic. In fact, he said, "God has commanded me to break the jaws of the wicked." So he had 20 children. He brought a lot of his sons with him to Kansas in order to, like, a lot of other abolitionists, in order to vote down slavery in Kansas. But he said, and a lot of people since have said, that despite his violence, he's actually quite perceptive in actually arguing that slavery is only going to end through violent means. Brown had been a drifter for most of his life. Actually had been successful for a while as a wool merchant, then lost his money, and it was kind of like an up and down, kind of chaotic life. He had this intense, almost crazed stare in his eyes, and I think I showed you the picture already, but I'll show you again on Thursday. There's all sorts of theories about what made this 56-year-old white man so committed to the fight against slavery. A lot of theories. But whatever the reason, he decided to commit his life to the mission to fight slavery. Now, he relocated to Kansas, was incensed, furious about the sack of Lawrence. And later in 1856, John Brown and his sons organized the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. And what that was is, literally John Brown and his sons grabbed 5 slavery men from their bed, dragged them outside, and hacked them to pieces. The pure brutality of this crime really made John Brown a national figure. And also is the worst nightmare of the South, right? The idea that, eventually this is going to happen, right? That somebody is going to use violence to end slavery. And Brown said it's the only way that's going to happen. The violence brewed throughout 1856 to the point where almost 200 people, I think a little over 200 people, wound up dying in Bleeding, Kansas. And the reason why this is so significant is because a lot of people say that this was, and I would agree, was Bleeding, Kansas was the opening act of the Civil War. The first time people were fighting and dying over the issue of slavery, where the country was split along sectional lines in a violent way. Just like the Boston Massacre was kind of the opening act to the Revolutionary War. The Boston Massacre took place in 1770, which was 5 years before the war. Bleeding, Kansas was really the opening act to the Civil War. It too took place, I think, 5 years before the Civil War itself. So this was a very, very ugly situation in Kansas, but it was directly the result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act having been passed. All right, guys, very good. So we'll stop now. Please remember, you watch this video from start to finish. In our live class on Thursday, we're going to talk about the 1856 election and also the beating of Charles Sumner, which was yet another ugly incident that took place as we embarked on the long road to Civil War. All right, so I will see you all on Thursday. Peace.